In turnout are kindly invited to remain in this room. For the others who wish to attend other session, I would kindly ask you to go to the other conference rooms. And if you don't know which room, if you need help in finding the room, please ask any of our staff members in the help desk. Thank you. Political behavior in the European Parliament elections, increasing turnout is going to start.
good morning, everyone, and thank you all for your interest in our panel, which will look at a voter advice application. In other words, a way in which voters can answer a set of questions, and on that basis, the application will tell them which political party is closest to their preferences. It's now the third time at the Robert Schuman Centre at the EUI that we have developed a VAA. It involves national teams, and one of the reasons why we can do this for all of Europe is precisely that we have access to such a rich group of researchers from all over Europe who can actually do the coding in the languages. So it is very much something that stems from the fact that we're a multinational, multicultural institution. We have 3 speakers who are going to speak to you about VAAs, but more generally about participation and turnout. Diego Garcia, founding convener of the ECPR and senior research fellow at the University of Lucerne. Stefan Marschall, chair in German politics from the Heinrich Heine University Düsseldorf, and Laura Sudlik, senior lecturer in politics from the University of Kent. And we're delighted to have all of you here. We thank you for your presence, and I'm going to hand over immediately to Diego so that we can then have enough time for questions and answers and debate with all of you. Diego, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. We are already short on time here, so we'll try to speed up a bit. Bridget already mentioned what we'll be talking about. So when we mention VAAs, we are talking about voting advice applications. The idea is to help users, help citizens cast a vote in a complicated issue environment with multiple parties competing, several concerns at stake. So what voting advice applications do is to simplify the political spectrum and offer voters an unobstructed view of their placement within the political space and vis-à-vis the political parties. Users answer a number of statements, a number of policy statements where they mark their agreement or disagreement on certain types of policy issues that range from environmental politics to taxation, from individual freedoms, so the whole spectrum of political competition. The app will then, through an algorithm, compare the position of the user on these statements with the position of the parties on the same statement and produce what we call a voting advice. This may take several forms. The most common is the match list, so that shows what's your closest parties when it comes to the policy issues. But it could take more complicated forms, more elaborate forms, like this bidimensional policy space where the parties and the user are shown at the same time, so that this user knows that some parties up in the center are closer, or even more complicated in terms of multiple issue dimensions through these spidergrams. But the logic, it's always the same, is to illustrate to the users to what extent parties are representing their views on policy issues. Voting advice applications are not something that we have invented, as it's something that has been out there for a long time. And I would like to leave the floor now to Stefan Marschall, who's convening with me the research network of the CPR on VAAs, to share with us some latest data about the development and diffusion of VAAs. Stefan. It keeps lighting mine.
Okay, take yours. Okay, I hope you have no problems to understand me. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Wonderful to talk about VAAs on this panel. I've been working on VAAs and doing research on VAAs for like 15, 16 years. I'm still especially involved in the German VAA, which is called Valomat. I will show you some slides on that later on. So in that way, it's great to be here and to talk about the European dimensions of VAAs. What I would like to show you is kind of a landscape, landscape we have developed concerning VAAs. And what you can see here is that VAAs is not a phenomenon which is restricted to Italy, not to Germany, but it's a worldwide, global phenomenon. What you can see, the countries which are dark green, they have at least 2 VAAs running before elections. The light green countries are countries which have, at least for our research, for the status we have now, we can say 1 VAA. It all started in the 1980s, when there was a paper pencil version of a VAA. So you could just work with a booklet. It was a Dutch system. In the Netherlands, they had kind of the stemwijzer. They still have it now digital. And it started as a paper pencil version, and in the 90s, that was transformed into a digital tool, an online tool. And since then, we can see an amazing spread of this tool all over the world. It has become very popular in a lot of countries, and it has kind of moved to many other countries, and you can see it's more or less a global phenomenon. Here you see a screenshot of the perhaps one of the most famous VAAs. It's the stemwijzer. That's the Dutch VAA, which is used, or which, as I said, was implemented first as paper pencil version, as a paper pencil tool, and then later on digitalized. And now, I don't know whether you can read that. So about 6.8 million usages were registered for the last usage, for the last version in 2017. The tool I'm very much familiar with, it's the Valomat. This is kind of, I don't know, it's German for Elektromat or something like that, tells you a little bit. So that's kind of a tool which is made for elections and which helps you when elections are coming up. And this tool has been has become very popular, very much established in Germany as a tool which is used before elections, and these numbers can kind of indicate that to you. You see the first Valomat was implemented in 2002. There was a usage number of about 3.6 million usages, and the last time we implemented the Valomat in 2017 for the federal elections, we had a usage number of 15.7 million usages. So a very, very high number, very remarkable. And what you can see for a lot of countries, especially those countries where these tools have kind of a certain standing and have been for a longer time, that the number of usages in relation to the electorate is kind of remarkably high. You can see here numbers for different countries, some very high performance countries when it comes to VAAs, and you see that the average, the numbers, the percentage numbers are done between, let's start with 10% or even going up to 50% in some cases, which means that about half of the electorate resorts to these tools. They use these tools before elections, and that's something which is worth to be doing research on, which is clear. And one thing is another, as you can see for the Finnish case, now we see from the Finnish national election study that indeed VAs have become, at least in this country, but that goes for other countries too, a very important, virulent source of information, which should have an impact on those using it. And we know we do have some findings on the impact, and Laura is going to say some words on the impact, especially on turnout.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to move to the impact of VAA on the public. So VAA are indeed designed for public usage, and under the assumption that voters need to be informed on their voting decision, and VAA provides a simple way of positioning themselves in relation to political parties. And we know that citizens, not each and every citizen has the time or the inclination to gather political information, and VAA provides a shortcut that enable voters to see themselves in the political landscape and be informed on what party they stand closest to. And once this process is facilitated through the tool, voters are better placed to make a choice, and they overcome the cost of gathering information so that the likelihood of them participating increases. So that is the reason why we believe, and there have been a number of academic studies, Diego has been one of the pioneers in exploring scientifically the impact of VAA on electoral participation. I think you might want to say a few words on the context on which there has been a proven effect of voting advice application on electoral participation. But the picture is pretty simple. The tool provides simple way of gathering political information that reduces the cost of voting so that there is an incentive for the general public to take part in election, particularly in election like European election that we know tend to be covered to a lesser extent by the press, tend to be less relevant in the life of citizens because we don't experience firsthand the European Union is sort of a distant entity. And a tool like VAA can really make a difference in such a context. Diego, do you want to say a few words on your works on turnout?
No, I mean, the point here is that, as an example, you can think of VAAs as somebody who read for you, on your behalf, all the party manifestos that are out there and provide you with a condensed version of it interactively. So the idea is that playing this tool for 10 minutes equals, in a sense, to having been exposed to all the information that is there in all the party manifestos. We know that from a theoretical point of view, but also from an empirical point of view, that lowering down the information costs has an effect, which is not only participation, but it is a chain of effects that lead to increasing participation. Using VAAs has been found to increase political interest because people may find parties that they didn't know about, or they may find that certain parties are way closer to them than they ever thought. And this in turn may incite political discussion among friends and family, may lead people to want to find out more, so as a way to increase political knowledge, and with more information, with more interest and more knowledge, increasing political participation as a result. These are some figures from a recent research project that I run with Andrea De Angelis and Alexander Trexel. And basically, all factors taken into account, the simple fact of having used VAA increases the likelihood that the user will cast a vote in the election by a factor that goes from 2 to 12%. So at the individual level, simply using this tool increases the chances, as a result, that people will turn out. Some more figures here are, well, this is a simulation. So we simulated how would an election in a given country be in terms of turnout rate had no VAA be made available to the citizens. And basically, well, cum grano salis, but in some instances, it would be that overall turnout rate would be some percentage points lower if it wasn't for the existence of Standvisor or Valomat or other types of VAAs. These are figures from national elections, but Stefan and his team did some research on European elections, so how VAAs can have an effect on European elections, and this I'd like to have.
So that's what you see on this slide. Just to explain the numbers, what you can see is based on indeed the users of the Valomat for the European elections in 2014. So we did a panel study, so we followed people and asked them at three different points of time about their probability to go to, or their likeliness to go to the election. So what you can see is in the panel, it's on average 28% said they used a VAA, and these 28%, I mean, that led to a turnout to 64.3. So now we did simulations, which means we played a little bit with the data, and if you double the number of VAA users, so if you would say not only 28 but 54% of the users they use the tool, that would lead to an increase in the turnout rate of 13%. So, and if you cut them down to the half, of course, to a lower turnout, which means the usage of VAs is connected or is associated to turnout, to the probability to go to elections. And the more people a VA use, the more people will go to the elections. It's an easy message.
We have figures on party choice as well. Laura, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but turnout and party choice are very intertwined. So the point is not only to bring people to the polls, but is also to bring people to think that they may vote for a different party based on the information they gathered. This type of research is more complicated because disentangling the intention to turn out the previous party choice, the new information is more complex, but relying only on self-assessments from the available data in selected countries, we see that VAs are leading people to reflect more carefully about their party choice. So the party they intended to vote for, in about 1 user in 5 declares to have doubted about their party choice thanks to the new information they gathered. Now, this is what we all would like to stress, because what's been told so far, in a sense, it's a web app that takes 5 minutes, so it could have the feel of a toy. This is nothing like that. This is actually an academic endeavor that takes a lot of time and a lot of work and a lot of research, because since we are offering this tool to millions of people, and since we know that people is going to be affected and their vote choice is going to be affected, the party positions out of which the vote advice is calculated have to be calculated in the most rigorous and precise and reliable way. For this, we implement a number of we use political science and social sciences knowledge to develop these applications, populate them with content, and I don't know if any of you wants to talk about all the social sciences that are needed to formulate the statements, whether parties are included or not, how to code the parties. Who wants to?
I can say a few words about the steps that leads to the production of a VAA. So the first step is to select what are the relevant policy dimensions on which to locate parties, so that there's a first selection of statements, relevant statements to the party and to the public. And once the statements have been selected, the relevant actors have to be selected. So who are those that will eventually appear on the screen of users? And again, there are a number of criteria that could range between those who have parliamentary representation, those who are predicted to gain parliamentary representation, or you can think of an even more all-inclusive criterion where you include all those parties that are going to present candidates to the election. So these are calls that are made by the researchers who are also in charge of coding the party manifestos and party policy statements on which they will then be located. And such a process is not just one academic giving his own opinion based on the documents. It tends to be a much more laborious process through which each individual codes the party and is then cross-checked with other individuals. And that is why, Diego, if you want to move to the next step, the next slide, this is why for a VAA like You and I 2019, where we have the EU 28 countries, we end up with having over 120 experts looking at the materials. And the number of manifestos, policy statements, interviews that party leaders give are all rigorously coded by researchers. And so it's not something that happens overnight. It takes a very long time. And by the time the tool, which again, as Diego said, looks a lot like a toy, like an app, it's a simple app, but at the back end of that app, there was a really rigorous and time-consuming process that a lot of people took part in. And I think, so now we are at over 33,000 documents coded. I think Diego might say a few words about the making of the You and I 2019.
Before I said that we didn't invent VAAs, but that's not entirely true. At least at the UI, at the Schumann Center, has been invented and developed the first transnational voting advice application in 2009. It was the EU Profiler. For the first time, all political parties in all the European Union were coded on the same questionnaire. So doing a questionnaire that works and makes sense in every country is already a challenge, because each of these statements have to discriminate among parties in each and every country. So this is already a challenge in itself, to map the competition to its transnational roots, if you want. We did this You and I again in 2019. It's available in all languages. It takes more than 120 experts to code the parties, and not only to code the parties, but to get in touch with the parties. Because in our method, political parties, are generating together with us the content. So while the academic team, the experts, code the political parties, the parties themselves are asked to self-place on the statements. Then the experts will cross-check the position of the parties and get back in touch with the parties in case there's discrepancy, because parties may be cheating, want to look more centrist than they actually are, or for many other reasons. So this took this time 10 weeks, this field work. We included 273 political parties from the entire union. Lorenzo Cicchi is there, who coordinated all these 122 people. It was a gigantic effort. And the results are these 33,000 documented positions, so that beyond the results, as I'll show you, there's room for learning a lot about political parties, the competition, and where parties stand. This is how you and I looks. This is an example of a question so that every user can mark their extent to which agree or disagree with, I don't know, whether the EU should punish member states that violate deficit rules. And parties are coded on the same question, so comparison will happen on the same questions. Users will be allowed to weight more themes, more importantly, because people may care about European issues more than social policies or the other way around, and this is all taken into account in the calculation. And this is what a fictional Dutch user would get. So the information that can be gathered is the proximity in terms of issues with the political parties, so which is the one closest to my ideas, which is the further away from my ideas. But people can go beyond and compare themselves with parties and across parties in terms of multiple thematic areas, or compare themselves in terms of this bidimensional political space where the economic left-right is supplemented with this pro-anti-integration dimension of the political competition. And when it comes to this transnationalization issue, we also offer the possibility, because the questionnaire is the same for all countries, to compare oneself with the parties in another country. I can find out what's my best party in Italy, because I'm Italian, but I would also find out in the Netherlands, because mobile citizens, for instance, are actually allowed to cast a vote in more than one country. And this is a tool that may support this transnationalization by allowing people a better knowledge of the political system, of the political spectrum in some countries, or, and this is more of a gimmick, but we found it really interesting also for research, this is my best party across the EU. So people can find out, even if most of the people cannot actually vote for the top party in Europe, according to their ideas, but this could kind of ignite a demand, a bottom-up demand for a transnationalization that doesn't need to follow necessarily the path of Euro parties. So this top-down approach, the research we did here for the EU profiler in 2009 already, out of the 2.5 million that used the EU profiler, about 20% declared that the EU profiler made them want for a party outside their own country. It's a theoretical possibility, but it's being embedded. Then, of course, you don't stick to the logo there, because every party is clickable, and this is where the science gets back. Every single party position can be studied. The relevant piece of information from the party manifesto or other type of relevant publicly available information is used, so that the users can be sure that the result comes from a solid piece of evidence, and the user can also learn about where parties are without having to do what our country teams have to do. So read everything, gather these documents, because it's all there, handy and usable. So I would like to leave it back to Brigitte for, in view of the discussion, for this we thought could be the question or the discussion points. We know that VAAs can increase turnout, and the EU is in bad need of participation for many different reasons in this election. The EU has an issue with the engagement of the younger generations, and ICTs are an obvious way to reach out. All this gigantic amount of verifiable information is implicitly a way to prevent or counterbalance electoral disinformation in other types of ICTs. I can think of social media, but I can think of many other things. And finally, this issue of which is not real, but it's getting more and more real with more and more mobile and dual citizens of the transnationalization of EP elections. Brigitte.
Thank you, and thank all three speakers, not just for the presentation today, but the enormous work, and to Lorenzo, the enormous work that went into creating, to using social science in this way to help citizens understand choice and options in politics. And the theme of the State of the Union is 21st century democracy, and ICT will be a very important part of that. We know that as communication channels change, the world is transformed. So now it's open. Who would like to ask questions, offer insight? And I would ask all of you to make sure that you use this. The more that it is used, the more you encourage others to use it, the richer the data as well, and also then the research, what we can learn from it in terms of participation and turnout. So please, the floor, it's open to you. Please.
I am from the European Investment Bank. I use a VAA similar system. I didn't know that was called VAA, and I appreciate it, and I send it to my children to be used. They are resident in the UK. They don't know what to vote and so on. So I'm a very great supporter. My doubt, or my worry is how you present a sentence or a question in this kind of tools. Give you an example of what is close to me. Now, Enzo Moavero has launched 5 ideas. One of them was the European Commission to issue bonds. If you ask, do you want EIB to issue bonds to have supplementary resources? Is a question I would generally answer yes, and I think my children will answer yes. But if you say, do you want the European Union to issue bonds, and therefore the European Investment Bank issue less bonds, and European Investment Bank is 1,000 times more efficient than European Commission, then my answer would say no. So how you, and I'm talking about something I know very, very, very well, but if you say, the second proposal, do you want the big high-tech companies to pay common TVA in Europe? The answer is yes, but if you add, and therefore making Amazon moving out from Luxembourg and Google out from Dublin and moving to London after Brexit, the answer is no.
Thank you. So the question relates to how you present political choice and political space. So who would like to?
Yeah. It's a very important point because, of course, the way you frame a proposal or a sentence, a proposition, the way you formulate it has implications on the response, the way people respond to that. I mean, that's the issue. That's your point. I mean, it's about, I think there are 2 challenges for those who do these tools. The first one is which statements to select. So given there's an abundance of questions in this world, or proposals or propositions, you could ask people, you have to decide for a certain number, and the numbers in most of the tools like 30 to 40 statements. So that's the first challenge, how to choose the questions you are going to ask. No? There's certain, depending on the tools, I mean, there's a variety of tools, as I mentioned, and there are different approaches to solve this problem. I can just say for the German Wahlomat that we have kind of a board of young first and second time voters. It's kind of an editorial board. They decide on which topics are chosen. And the second point is, of course, and we have already researched on that, that the way you formulate a question could have implications on the way people respond to that. You should kind of follow certain rules. You should avoid double-barreled questions. You should avoid manipulating words in the questions or in the statements. There are some rules, but it's tricky. It's a tricky issue, and it's something we have to pay a lot of attention to.
Please.
May I
yes?
a super small addition to this? Ideally, the saliency of the statement, that is, the saliency of the issue in the political competition in that given moment, in that given place, should clarify, because parties will take stands and The idea is always that parties will take stands and the issues that we select are salient. So there's a public discourse behind it. Another problem is that you are hinting at the complexities of politics. So from the Eurobonds on how these are implemented and what are the consequences. The problem of VAAs is that most of the time they are preaching to the converted. The usage profile is highly educated, very knowledgeable and interested in political matters. So they are talking to a rather sophisticated public when it comes to their political interest and knowledge, though they are meant to help really somebody else. So this goes back to our old problem of engaging with people with no interest. I don't think you need the VAA to find out your position on that issue. Funny, because we had it in 2014, the same question, 5 years ago. There should be common Eurobonds. That was a problem.
Please.
Hi, I'm Ofra Klein from the European University Institute. I really enjoy your presentation, and I find the VAA a great tool. I always use it as well for national and local elections in the Netherlands, and I find your results very interesting about how this increases turnout. I wonder, in as much this is, because the results are on the national level, in as much this is applicable to the European level, because of course turnout is a bigger problem there. And related to this, with the preaching to the converting the converted, what is being done to spread this tool to a broader audience, especially those who don't really participate? Because if you indeed use Politico to advertise the tool, well, of course, those who read Politico are interested in European politics and will already participate. So what is being done to do that? Other than that, a very small question about the dimensions you showed. There was one dimension pro and against EU, and the other dimension I did not notice. But in as much is it actually good to stay into this kind of like pro-against EU debate, especially if you want to motivate people to participate in European elections. And to me, it seems like it's being presented as a very much a black or white issue, which could even increase polarization on this issue, which might not be a good thing. So why did you decide to include this dimension very prominently? Thank you.
Who would like to?
Well, in terms of, I'm just going to say a couple of words in terms of diffusion. You said you're from the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, VAA originated a long time ago. I was working there 10 years ago, and my students were very well aware of what VAAs are. I remember asking them, do you know what a VAA is? And they looked at me like, do you know like what the sun is? So I think there's a cultural dimension, a country-specific dimension to that. In those countries where VAAs have been around for a long time, they tend to be sort of a given, right? And voters would expect to find VAAs available to them. And I think in that sense, it's a very diverse situation in different countries. And I think tools like a European-wide VAA really help spreading the word in those countries where VAA haven't been in place for such a long time. So a tool like EU and I is really beneficial in sort of spreading the use of the platform and making voters acquainted with the idea of having that resource on top of everything else at their disposal. So I'm sure there are still major differences across the European Union, but in order to bridge the gap, we need more European-wide tools, and I'll pass it on to Stefan or Diego to answer
You
your...
don't want to pick up on the other one, eh?
No,
because
I'm
it was a
leaving
good
that to
question.
you.
It was a good question. This I leave to Bridget instead. But because isn't this part of the politicization of the EU? The fact that the EU election is also about being anti-Europe in the sense of how this has been going on until now in terms of integration. Is it? Well,
So politics in Europe today is no longer just one cleavage, the left-right. There's also the demarcation integration cleavage, or it's now called identity politics cleavage. And you see there are questions in the VA on attitudes towards the EU, but also attitudes towards immigration. And that tells you a lot about that second cleavage. And I think that's a really salient cleavage in politics in Europe today. So it gets at something that's really there. That's really there.
and this dimension is blended to turn the three dimensions, so the cultural, the economic, and the European integration that is specific to this election. We wanted to have nonetheless a two-dimensional graph to make it more understandable. And the cultural dimension, like Hans-Peter Krisi has been saying for a long time, it's going parallel to the pro-anti-Europe. So this, on the same axis, parties are loading both cultural progressiveness and pro-European integration, go on the same side almost everywhere in Europe. We found out through this.
May I add something to your first point on preaching to the converted or preaching to the choir and how to change that? I mean, that's a general challenge we have in civil education measures, instruments. It's always about the question how to get to the people who are not by per se involved in politics, who have kind of who are delineated from politics and who cannot be approached. And it's, I mean, this tool is kind of, in a lot of ways, a pull tool. You're looking for it, you're searching for it, and then you use it. Again, a little bit contributing German experience to that, if you allow. What we did is, or what the Federal Agency for Civic Education, which is responsible for the Valomat, did, they went offline again. So what they did, they created a sticker Valomat, a sticker VAA, so where you have kind of, where you go, for example, to marketplaces, where you go into schools. You have some walls, you have the statements on the walls, on the posters, and you can put stickers on below the posters, and then you take this sheet and there are some colors on that, and you put it in the machine, and the machine explains that to you, or gives you a printout where you can see which party is the closest to you. Just saying, well, you have to go to the people, you have to go where perhaps it hurts sometimes, where people are perhaps not interested in politics. And so that's something that's, as I said, it's a general challenge, and you can use it with measures like that. But then again, if you look at the numbers of, we had, as I said, about 16 million usages in Germany for the Valomat, and about 10% of these users said, well, we are not interested in politics. Which means at least 10%, of course not 90%, but 10%, and if you say 10% out of, I don't know, 50 million people, that's something. So it's possible to work with these tools to reach these people, but it's difficult, and you have to think about new ways to do that, perhaps by going, for example, offline again.
Can I also just say on diffusion, so we're not just working with Politico, because of course that is an attentive public. What we do is develop media partnerships in every member state. And that's, in other words, we need to get out there beyond the Brussels bubble to get into where the elections are actually happening. And the more media partnerships you have, and the more people talk about stuff, the more you can get it out there into friendship groups, families, then people will, you know, I'm doing this, why don't you have a go, and whatever. So it's really to work through at every level that we can. And so I encourage again all of you, family and friends, just keep getting it out there. Please, there's another.
I just have a practical question. If you have data, which member states really they use the VAAs?
I didn't hear.
Sorry, we didn't hear.
So, I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just from your information and the data that you collect, which are the member states that usually they use this platform, this tool?
So the data on usage of the VAA.
What countries are more Northwest, Scandinavia. This originates in Benelux, Germany, Scandinavia, and in terms of massive usage, it's there.
Which I was suspecting that, that's why I asked, but which means that you have a bigger challenge to the Southerns and to the Easterns. Thank you.
True. We see this anyways with the participation rates of the parties when it comes to placing them. Lorenzo has the correct figures, but the countries in the Northwest, almost every party collaborates with us because they are expecting this. In the East, it's a blend of things. If users don't care, parties will not, because this is a communication. This is a platform for communication. We launched. We still don't have users, but we have already 10 complaints by 10 different parties who were too small for us to include them, but they see in this an opportunity to appear in the same way as the big party would, because here everybody has the same space. So we don't know if it's the parties or it's the users, but one triggered the others.
And of course you're right.
The culture of accountability, I think.
Europe does not have one political culture, or attitudes towards democracy differ across. There are clusters of countries that have particular sets of attitudes and others that are very different. And that's heterogeneity and diversity defines Europe. So we have to work with what we have, and in one way that's probably also one of Europe's great strengths, that it is so diverse. Pardon? Or weaknesses. It can be both. It can be both. Who else would like to, please?
Just a quick question. I wanted to know how much you then, after having analyzed all the programs, cross-check it directly with the parties, or do you keep the stance that you extracted from the programs? Do you compare it with their point of view, or do you just stick with what your research found? Thanks.
Well, this depends a lot on what VAA we are talking about. What we do here, it's collaboration with the parties, because some parties are complex to find out, in the East especially. The party systems are not so consolidated, so we basically need the experts to help us for all those parties that are not going to place themselves. In Germany, there are no experts. It's only the parties. I think Stefan can say more.
Yeah, as we mentioned before, there are different approaches to solve this problem and different perhaps cultures when it comes to VAAs. In Germany, we have this idea that in the end, the party should decide on its position and should not be corrected by experts. You can have very long discussions on that, I know, but now my point is, okay, we can start this discussion now, but my point is, what are we to say that an answer which is kind of given by the party board is not a correct one? Why couldn't it be that parties change their position over time? So what do we compare it with? With the party platform? Okay, that could be kind of outdated. It could be kind of, there are new challenges, new things which happen. Parties might change their position. And what is kind of the real party position? How do we measure a party position? Is it what a board said, what the party platform says, what the party members say? So it's very complicated. So that's why in Germany we have this approach to say, okay, we leave it to the parties. And the parties take it very seriously. They take these issues and they know that it's published, that people talk about that. So that they really issue a position which is read by a lot of people, and perhaps by more people than we have people reading party platforms, the party programs for the elections. So in that way, our experience is that parties take that very seriously. And by the way, in the German Wahlomat, they have also the possibility to give explanations to their positions, which all of the parties do. So you can see and you can kind of validate a little bit with the explanations whether this is kind of the true or real party position. But there are different approaches, and of course, I think there's not a gold standard. But okay, as I said, there are different views on that.
So far we'll only be talking about parties, but some systems are candidate-based. So the story is again different. For instance, Ireland, we always have this problem with you and I because individual candidates there are so important. Or in Switzerland, Smart Vote in Switzerland is used. It does not even tell you parties. It only helps you to find out the 26 that you have to put in list for the Canton Zurich, for instance. There, it's the candidates that decide. There's nobody's gonna place the candidates. When it comes to the party, it depends on how you conceptualize a party. As a complex body who do you rely on? Leadership, or in the case of German parties or Dutch parties, they have somebody that works on VAAs only to address us when it comes to, there is a person in most of the Dutch and German parties that know exactly what we are asking them, and they do this as a job. So,
can I ask you, is there any further question from the floor? I don't, please.
How can you prevent corruption? I mean, we've got tremendous inequality now economically, and we have governments which have gone in the wrong direction, Trump, Brexit, and so forth, because in a way they've been listening more to structures of power than to the people. So you get this reaction of populism, which also destroys democracy. I'm trying to figure out how we can have this response by the government to the individual so that the individuals feel that their needs are met by the infrastructure instead of having to destroy the structure.
I think that's a very big question beyond voter advice application. Would any of you like to respond?
I'm not giving you the big answer to this question now. A very small contribution out of the perspective of VA research, perhaps. I mean, when you look at populist movements, etc., that was actually one question also, or one point we raised at the end of the presentation, whether this could help to fight disinformation and perhaps even to make politicians more responsive to voters. I mean, that's kind of the issue you're raising. Indeed, I mean, if you look at these tools, these are just issue-driven tools. So there's no personal question concerning personality or candidates in these tools. So that's going away, or that's kind of shifting the focus a little bit more again to issues and not to persons. And then, of course, it's something where you kind of ask people what you have from parties, and to have kind of a basis then for an understanding another culture of people and asking parties to do what they would like to do them. So in that way, as I said, a very small contribution, but of course that cannot really be the key to your question, I guess.
Can I just ask how you have handled the United Kingdom in this VAA, given that we don't know if the UK will hold European elections?
Yeah, this one is for me, as I'm based in the UK. So we were in standby. Is it happening? Is it not happening? So for a long time, we were doubting, is it the 29th of March? Is it the 12th of April? Are they going to be out? Are they going to stay in? Are they going to present candidates? So we were sort of in standby and in contact with Lorenzo and Diego. And when we got closer, we decided, okay, we are going to have it ready to go in case this European election in the UK actually happens. Now, the big problem is that parties are not quite campaigning yet. And will they campaign which is still a big question mark. So we have a lot of, we have coded the materials that are available. Of course, there are no European election manifestos out there at the moment, but we sort of know their position, and we are operating under the assumption that there will be, and we are coding parties, how would they position themselves if they were to run European election. And now we think that there will be European election. So we are sort of in this gray space where we have data, but it's not the freshest data that you find in other countries. There's actually a campaign taking place. But I think we managed to have a fully functioning compass for the United Kingdom. And I'll invite you to try it out, and if it's not, if you find any
the VAA for the election that
they might not be
new challenge.
Yes, indeed. I think we've just come to the end of our time. I'd like to...
Is he allowed?
I think he is.
We talk every day.
Can I just add something? Because we were talking about the voting advice application also as a way of, helping citizens to get information and to make sensible choices at elections. Now, something that has developed in the last 10 years since we started with the EU profiler at the UI is, of course, the role of social media, and in particular the role of Facebook and all that. And we know that there are also requests from Facebook to Facebook, also from the European institutions, to avoid disinformation and to counterbalance the attempts of those against the European integration and against sensible choices to use the social media. Now, we have, apart from the voting advice application, we also have a tool online that is providing information to mobile citizens where they can vote. So those who are in a different country, and that they can make a choice on where they vote, whether they vote in their country of residence or whether they should vote in their country of origin, and what they have to do, and so on. So it's an information platform that provides information to mobile citizens. Now, Martina, who is our communication specialist here for our tool, has now quite an interesting experience with Facebook with us promoting these two websites, and we are now in some countries we are being faced with Facebook rejecting this information on Facebook because they say that this is political information. And that is, it varies from country to country, but one can see that it is not only important to provide unbiased information, but it's also important, to overcome those obstacles with Facebook actually to spread those news.
I think that's a very useful reminder to us as we close, that political communication itself has been absolutely transformed, and Facebook, social media, one kind or another, are so important in how people receive information today, that really does matter. Can I thank on all your behalf my three panelists and all of you for a very engaging discussion on the VAA, and we want you all to use it. Thank you.
Thank you.
me quello che interessa a me è che la session parte in orario. Inequalities in the EU is going to start. Now I leave the floor to the moderator.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to welcome you in this De Gasperi room at the Archives of the European Union. I want to sincerely thank all our panelists for taking part in our session at the State of the Union. We'll discuss in particular with Lidia Pereira, President of the Youth of the European People's Party, also Mrs. Sikut, Member of the Estonian Parliament, Mario Pagano, Researcher and Coordinator of the Working Group Engaged Academics, and also Professor Van Parijs, Professor of Philosophy at Université Catholique de Louvain, and also Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center of Advanced Studies. So let me refer you to this great State of the Union program in which you can find further information about all speakers. I have to say that this panel has been organized in a common interview with Theo and Maria for the researchers-led initiative Thoughts for Europe. Briefly, Thoughts for Europe fosters debates about the future of Europe among the EUI community and beyond. We intend to promote policy-oriented discussions that bridge the gap between academia and the political reality and think of the EU in pragmatic terms. Today, as in all our events, we expect lively discussions and debate with the audience. So I'll ask our speakers, very gently, to be diligent with timing. Without further notice, I'm going to ask the first question to all our panelists. What does intergenerational inequality mean? And what is the most urgent intergenerational inequality that the EU must address? We will start with Professor Van Parijs, then with Lydia Pereira, Mrs. Sekut, and Mario Pagano. Please, Professor Van Parijs.
Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for being late. I had to take part in another panel. Yes, so two questions. One, what does intergenerational inequality mean? Well, it could mean three different things. First thing, there is an important distinction to be made between two interpretations of generations. Generations can be age groups, people who are currently at a certain point in their lives, on the one hand, and generations as cohorts, where people are defined by the date of their birth. Now, this may seem a bit of a nitpicking, but it's not at all, because, of course, there are inequalities between age groups. For example, some people at certain ages don't have voting rights. Some people are entitled to a pension. But this tends not to be a problematic sort of inequality. So it's a great privilege for me to have a pension, but no worry, if you live long enough, don't drink too much, you'll reach that stage too. So that's usually fine. So the issues of intergenerational inequality rather arise in terms of inequalities between cohorts, people born at different stages that all go through all the ages if they are lucky, but there may be inequalities there. The second interpretation may speak about inequalities in this broad sense, but some of these inequalities are unproblematic. For example, when I first came to EUI as a Jean Monnet Fellow in 1990, I was given an office in the Convento San Domenico. And one thing that struck me is that there were these doors to our offices, and the faces of the monks or the saints was at the level that ornated the top of the doors were at the level of our faces. So to get into the office, you had to do that. So between cohorts, there can be big differences in height, in average height over time. So we are much taller on average than people a number of decennia ago, a number of centuries ago. But, I mean, is this potentially unjust? Doesn't sound like it. So the third interpretation of what you must be meaning, in fact, today, is that some of these intergenerational inequalities may actually be unjust, are potentially unjust. And the way it was phrased, it felt a bit as if your generation was sort of unjustly treated by our generation, or the generation of all the people in the room. And indeed, you can have that feeling. For example, it's generally thought that people in your generation will have to work longer in their lives. So retirement age will perhaps be 70 rather than 65 by the time you retire. And is this unjust? Well, it may be just a compensation for the fact that there is another inequality in your favor, which is that your life expectancy is quite a bit longer. Or there is another important dimension of potentially unjust inequality, which is that one can expect that your material standard of living, how much you'll be able to consume in material terms, will be less than our generation, living standard measured in those terms. But again, is this necessarily an injustice? Because your cohort, relative to mine, is incredibly richer than ours, and will keep becoming richer in one dimension, which is access to information, access to knowledge. I mean, how much we had to struggle in order to get a book from a library, in order to get fresh information from the rest of the world, when I was your age, compared to the ease, a few clicks and you get, this of course can be of great importance also in terms of your welfare, globally speaking. So I think and your first question, what does intergenerational inequality mean? I think in this case, It's a potentially unjust inequality between cohorts, between people born at different stages. And you can have some prima facie unjust inequalities, which are just a compensation for something else. Then very briefly, your second question, what is the most urgent intergenerational inequality that the EU must address? Unsurprisingly, I'll immediately say the inequalities related to climate change and related to that, the depletion of natural resources. This is a major problem, and the EU is, in a way, ideally placed relatively to nation states, to member states, to deal with it for two reasons. One is its democratic deficit, and the second reason is that it's supranational. See, democratic deficit, because it's true that the European institutions, in particular the Commission, are less disciplined by the next elections than national politicians are. And elections, the best possible electoral democracy, will still be a dictatorship of the present generation of voters. And therefore, a certain dose, or the right sort of dose, of democratic deficit is a way of getting the long-term prevail over the short-term interests of the voters. That's one reason why you must be able to rely on the European Union to force, to coerce to some extent, or to get commitments on the part of the members in order to protect the longer term. And the second reason why it's ideally placed relative to nation states is that there is a massive problem of tragedy of the commons, or the paradox of collective action, because in a little country like mine, Belgium, with about 1/10% of the world population, why should we bother to impose ourselves a cost in order to prevent climate change or some of its worst effects? If we do nothing and the others do what they need to do, the job will be done for us at no cost for us. And if the others don't do what they need to do, the disaster will be on us, even if we do something. So there is a massive problem of the fallacy of composition, tragedy of the commons, because if every country does what is in its own interest, we are heading for disaster. In order to prevent that, you need institutions like the European Union in order to take a collective stance, both internally and then in negotiations with the rest of the world. So, no doubt for me, second question, climate change and the related depletion of natural resources is the central issue, and you'll be suffering far more than our generation from the potential consequences of it.
Okay. Thank you. Lydia?
Is it here? It's already working. It's fine. Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me, Christine, for this panel, which relates massively to the questions and the concerns of the young people these days. What does intergenerational inequality mean? Well, it seems like a very difficult question to answer. And so I'll try to answer that with a very basic concept, the concept of family. Our society is based on families. So we have the young, the in-between, and the older generations. A family lives under the same roof, protects each other, helps raising up the children, and the children that once become young adults will care and look after the older generations. And if we see the way the family is organized, we see that also there's a reflection of that in the organization of the state. So when we look at in particular to the pension systems, to our social security, we see that payments and contributions made today are from the in-between, so from the people that are working in protecting the pensions of the people that worked before. So there's this sort of solidarity in generations. But we see, and for many reasons, and one of them is particularly relevant in Europe, which is the demography. We are one of the oldest continents in the world. And so we see that this intergenerational solidarity or intergenerational contract, if I may say, which is also in the end a social contract between generations, is indeed at stake, and it's even threatened by the difficulties that we are facing these days due to demography, due to the change of the job market, due to technological progress, and we don't see sufficient response from the institutional side to offset this massive change. So, what does my generation have to struggle with? We see that these days we don't speak about buying a house because it's difficult for us to pay a house, and we also see progressively the devaluation of the salary associated to higher education, which poses a problem. Like, before, in the past, we wanted to have the most educated generation. Now we have it, but now it does not reflect in our salaries. So this is another issue. Now, if we go back before the crisis, the wages fell dramatically. So, in particular for those who were entering the job market, the young people, and on top of the shortage of salaries, we also faced more professional uncertainty, because for us it's becoming more and more difficult to in this volatile job market to really compete with the older generation that is already working. So intergenerational inequality means that we have to find that we have within this concept of family to find a way to make sure that we keep looking forward for the next generation. Now, where does the EU have to focus on to deliver, to protect and to ensure that the social intergenerational contract works? It's exactly to deliver on defining a strategy to provide quality employment, to discuss a strategic plan for demography, because this is not. We speak a lot about subsidiarity, and this is how we should deal with within member states, but we have to find also a strategy, a common strategy to face this, and then I think we can discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sikut?
Thank you. Hello, and it's good to pick up from where the other presenters left off. I won't speak about cohorts or the definition of generation, and take up where Professor Van Baris left off and talk about the unjust inequalities. If we take into account the material standard of living that was mentioned, the need, that work base, that you can afford your house or an apartment, then often when we talk about unjust, we mean who pays and who benefits. And in economics, we actually have the method of generational accounting. We can do the complex calculations and get the result. But no matter what the result is, what are the checks and balances, it can be explained to the public, but at the end, what matters is how people perceive whether our tax system, our society is just if we look at the perspective of different generations. So we can do the objective calculation and get a result, and maybe find out that, no, our society is quite just in terms of who pays and who benefits. But the people might not perceive it that way, because how different groups, whether they're young people or elderly, how they can participate in the society, how are they involved in the policy making, it differs, because the generations prefer to participate in different activities. They prefer to participate in different ways. When we take the simple example of elections, in most countries, elderly are more active in coming out, in giving their vote. But coming from Estonia, I would give an Eastern European perspective to the discussion, where when the focus is often on the young generation being disadvantaged or not having the same opportunities or their voice heard at the same level as the older populations or older generations, then in Eastern Europe, where the older generations spent their life during the Soviet Union, they didn't have the possibility to save or build this security for their retirement. So now we're in a situation where, yes, we contribute a lot to pay the pensions, but I feel, and a lot of people feel, that we still don't give the older generation what they have earned or what they deserve. And it differs between countries, because in Estonia we have very generous parental leave and benefit system. We have very generous child benefits. We have free education, free higher education as well. But the average pension is lower than the minimum wage. So in terms of this who pays and benefits, I would say that maybe older generations are treated unfairly, or they are in an unequal position in many Eastern European countries, just considering our past. But the material things are not the most important in this life. So when I think about the unjust inequalities, where this unjustness comes into is values and the climate policy or the environmental policy. So this is where I see that generations have very different views. Whether we talk about the mobility, the feelings for open society, immigrations, they are very different, and it's often linked with their age, the cohort or type of birth. So when looking into the future and thinking about more generational equality in society, so in addition to doing the generational accounting exercise, we should acknowledge the reason to actively enable different generations to participate, to involve them, to have public debates, value debates, because I'm an idealist. Although the generation have different views on different policies, whether it's environmental policy, during debate, presenting arguments, I think we can, in each member states and in EU level, actually come to a consensus. What is the best way forward, and that's generationally equal or just.
Thank you very much. Mario?
Yes, I'm happy that Professor Van Paris and also Rina Sikut mentioned already the urgency of climate change and environmental protection as one of the most urgent threats to future generations, I would say also to present generations. And in this regard, I would like to actually focus on this, so on the intergenerational climate injustice or inequality. Climate change and sustainable development were framed already in international law in really intergenerational justice terms. Every generation seems under the Bartland Report on Sustainable Development and even under the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Convention for Climate Change, as a kind of a right to meet its own needs. So what does it mean, intergenerational justice? In terms of environmental protection and sustainable development, it means to have a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the capacity of future generations to meet its own needs. So there seems to be a kind of a right to meet its own needs. But the problem of this right is that it is somehow vaguely framed, vaguely specified. And when there is the problem of lack of clarity, very often in legislation, there is also a problem of enforceability of rights. So how can we enforce a kind of a right to meet our own need for people who have not born yet or for people that at the moment are very, very young? And so in the end, we face a situation where we have a victim that basically has no remedy, no right to compensation, and a guilty that basically has no punishment. And who is this guilty? So just to give a few data on what kind of climate and environmental inequality we are experiencing at the moment. On average, now worldwide, a 16-year-old person has a probability of almost 90% of experiencing a 2 degrees world, which is a very dramatic and catastrophic situation in terms of climate change, in 2054. A person that today is 60 years old has a probability of only 2% of experiencing this scenario of 2 degrees world in 2054. But who contributed the most? In the US, for instance, the per capita emissions of a 60-year-old person is 3 times higher than the one of a 16-year-old citizen. So we have a problem of accountability, because those who basically contributed the most to polluted don't pay. And the problem of representation, because those who suffered the most, the real victims, have no voice, cannot vote, and are not properly represented in institutions. Yesterday I was checking the average age in the European Parliament is 53 years old, just to give a number. And there is a further inequality. It is the fact that the majority of 60, 64 years old citizens live in high or upper middle income countries, while majority of 15, 19 years old citizens live in low or lower middle income countries. So the problem is that the weight of climate change, once we exceed the 1.5 degrees, will affect the most the youngest and the poorest countries, which will most likely lead in the future, imagine in 2100, to huge waves or climate-induced displacements. So this is the kind of inequality we are talking about at the moment, especially as far as climate change and environmental protection are concerned. I have other things to say, but I would like to keep them for the following discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will have very short follow-up questions. I will ask all our speakers to be quite concise. We can always go in more details during the discussion. And I will ask those follow-up questions in the reverse order. So I will start again with you, Mario. Actually, it's quite a general question, but both engaged academics and Force for Europe are very concerned by this issue. How can the EU address young generations' needs and concerns and also endorse their visions of a reformed Europe?
Well, as far as, if we talk about youth in general or youth in a particular climate situation, there are a few things that the EU, I would say, could do. For instance, as we said before, to provide representation, a better representation. 53 years old on average in the European Parliament is quite a high age in terms of people taking decisions on behalf of. Of course, you cannot blame those people if they get elected. There's also a problem of participation from the bottom, of young people that do not want to participate. So the real question should be, why young people do not want to participate? Probably because they don't feel addressed by institutions and by the decision making. And in terms of participation, it's quite easy to mention nowadays what is happening with the Fridays for Future movement, but I think it's a good start. It's a good example because the movement started by Greta Thunberg, I think, is providing a new voice to young people, and it's actually putting also pressure to decision makers because, for instance, today the UK just said that the UK Parliament just declared the climate emergency state, which is something that never happened before. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mrs. Sikut, until recently you were Minister of Health and Labour in Estonia. So I wanted to ask you how to ensure a race to the top in terms of social protection and social rights in the EU, and how would you redesign social models, in particular healthcare, to ensure equality across generations?
As Anna-Lydia mentioned, that the worries that different generations have, that they are actually pretty similar and basic, with the exception of environment. But so in each country and also EU, when we design our social security systems, we need to focus on the stages in life when you move from like one status to another, from being a young person to being an employee or employer, or from retiring from your work life, to ensuring that the movement from one stage to another is flexible, taking account person's preferences and whether it's financial situation, education. And this is something that we can commonly contribute. But I really believe that in designing, whether it's your health system, social system, or educational system, it should be a part of this like secure network. It should be available for everyone. It doesn't matter whether you work as a yoga instructor part-time and study, or whether you're an employer or a full-time employee. For each type of work, each type of contributions that you make, you might have worked for past 40 years and you still have 3 years until your retirement, and you want to voluntarily teach children or teach them to play chess or something. It all should be possible in our societies. You don't have to make decisions based on whether this gives me health insurance or whether this covers my possible need for nursing care in the future. You should be able to make your life choices based on your preferences and the social security and education. If you want to study something else, to be active in the labor market for the next 10 years, you should be able to do that. And I don't think there are generational differences. If the system supports everyone, I think it's seen as just. And I'll give a very colorful example from past week. Hairdresser, since I was the Minister of Health, shared her worry about her friend who's actually discussing on marrying her partner because that's the way to get health insurance. We have 50 different options to get health insurance in Estonia, and one is that if your child is more than 3 years old but less than school age and you're married to your partner, you're eligible for health insurance. So she was considering making a very important life choice of becoming married for the reason of getting health insurance. And this is not how we should make our life choices. This is not what we want from our social systems to put pressure on us. So security, social security for everyone, supporting each generation, and we'll have a very just society.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Sigurd. Lydia, so we've been through different crises over the last year, and this has kind of eroded also the affection of the youth for the European project. Mario mentioned the average age of parliamentarians at the European Parliament. So how would you make sure that the present and future generations can help to forge the future European Union and also reform it?
Thank you. I think one of the, the youth, we are a bit concerned, of course, with the climate change because it will undoubtedly affect us. But the disaffection with the EU project is that when we see banks being bailed out, for example, and then we see that we don't have the money to pay our own house, that we have to postpone our family. When we see this, and because we have to have we are still in completing the union, but when we see these cases happening, I understand that there's somehow some sort of discontent with politics in general, and I also the way to tackle this is to understand what the young people, what is their civic engagement at the moment. Because we say that they don't care about politics, but they care about civic engagement because they participate in volunteering, for example, or in associations. So they take part in the society. But we have to understand that it's very difficult for a young person with the current framework of politics, when we have the manifestos, when we have to work 40 hours a week and maybe more, when we have when our day-to-day life, our routine is always very overwhelming. We don't have time to look, to see things in perspective and to think, okay, where do I want to go? Where should I vote? Should I vote for? So all these things mixed are creating some conflict, I think, and I believe that it's one of the reasons why young people are somehow disengaged with politics, related to climate change, and also related to the economic and financial crisis that we just passed. This is a lesson learned for the future, because I know that the next European Commission and all the politicians in national governments, they now understand that we have to look after for the next generations. And this includes taking care of financial supervision to prevent future public debt and burden for the younger generations, and of course climate change. Because only by doing that we can make sure that we have a cohesive society, that we protect the future and we anticipate the future somehow.
Thank you very much. Professor Van Barijs, you worked a lot on the relationships between justice and democracy, and especially considering what we've been already discussing, if we look in particular at the electoral participation and the 21st century democracy, which is the overall theme of this State of the Union, how to ensure the youth and also EU citizens generally engagement to vote and to participate in the election. Would you advocate for an extension of the suffrage, for instance?
Okay. Yes, I think about 20 years ago I published an article which was under the title The Disenfranchisement of the Elderly and Other Ways of Securing Intergenerational Justice, and where I discussed a number of proposals. For example, in order to get a strong electoral weight for the young, you could, for example, scrap the voting rights for people from 70. Right? You don't let them vote anymore. Or that reduces considerably the average age of the voter, which is higher than the average age of the members of the European Parliament, because there are few members in European Parliament who are over 80, but there are increasing fraction of the voters who are over 80. So that's one idea I discussed there. I didn't really endorse it. luckily, because I'm not so far from 17 now. And two, another one was of course, to reduce the minimal age for voting, and that is being seriously discussed and indeed implemented in some places down to 16. But the turnout among the young is very low, so it may not make that much of a difference. Another proposal I discussed, which also led me to participate in a debate on Italian television, was real universal suffrage. That is, you give a vote even to the babies, but of course with a proxy vote for the parents. And that would then reduce or increase the time horizon for two reasons. One is that the average parent of minor kids has an age that's lower than the overall average for the whole of the voting population. And secondly, these people are there daily with these little babies who will, or all the kids who will live far longer than themselves, so that, and their care for them may take them a longer term view. Anyway, I don't think any of these proposals would make a big difference. One thing that makes, I think three things that do make a difference in the functioning of our democracy. One I already mentioned before, which is having some levels of decision-making that are immunized to some extent against immediate electoral pressure. And so having the European Commission impose rules of government, it strikes me in my country, in Belgium, where there is an active climate discussion, how much in the pushing for stricter legislation is really strengthened, and by the thing, the European Union asked us to do this and this and this. And without this pressure, top-down, far less would be done. That's one thing. The second thing is really that what we need in our democracies to make more room for deliberation, rather than just people voting in function of their immediate interests. I got somewhat angry at in the previous panel with one of the other panelists who was arguing it was about basic income, all in terms of who gains, who loses, who is going to be in favor because of, in net terms, I would gain more than what they would pay in additional taxations, and conversely for the others. This is not the way in which a democracy, good democracy, must function. A good democracy means that we are in a forum of discussion, we discuss with each other, and we try to find, through arguments, something that sounds to us fair. And fair then among the present generation, but also taking into considerations the later generations. That's the second component. And the third component is the following. Voting, whether elections or direct democracy, is something that flattens the preferences of the people, the importance. So whether you care a lot about an issue or not at all, practically indifferent, you get one vote. Whether you have a very strong, well-motivated, well-documented preference for a particular party, it counts exactly to the same extent as the person who is just voting at random as they are queuing. So how can we correct that? By taking to the streets. And so I was amazed and admirative. In my country, we had, and it was Greta started the process, but it was the Spabelers, people who every Thursday, you had all these kids from secondary school who were demonstrating in Brussels, coming from their schools, led by girls. No surprise, their life expectancy is greater than that of boys, so they'll live longer, so they'll have, in new computations earlier, they'll suffer more. Led by girls, 15-year-olds, 16, 17-year-olds, and the voice which you can express by taking to the streets, of course, is what enables you to express the strength of your... You've thought about it, you think it will be terrible here, and you'll suffer it, and you don't have voting rights. In addition, there it's not only a flattening to one, it's zero vote for these people, and that affects the political decision-making. Of course, it's difficult to keep going. It's always, you get many people, then less and less people, and so on. But this is your generation, if you want your interest to be saved on grounds of justice, not just because it's good for you, take to the streets.
Thanks for this very clear advice. So now we are going to open the floor for questions. As you saw, our panelists were very good at being direct and concise in their answers. So the same for you. Please introduce first your name. Then if you have a comment, be short, and then also be straightforward with your question. We would like to take as much as possible questions, also to make sure that everybody has a voice. Another guideline is, please, if you wish, I encourage you to actually address your question to a number of panelists, not just only one, also to foster debate and discussion. So let's start. Who has a question? Yes.
My name's Teresa, I'm from Australia, and I would like to throw out a question which concerns the end of the debate, because in Australia we have compulsory voting, and what particularly Philippe's opinion would be on that, but for the entire panel, in the sense that that does also ensure that you get a representation across age groups, in a way that when you don't have obligatory voting isn't always the case. But also to make the comment that that doesn't mean that in Australia we have necessarily better political engagement or a sense of, we still have a sense of apathy, so not negating the need for non-electoral forms of participation, but whether you think that compulsory voting could potentially have some positive aspects for Europe.
Yes. Maybe we're going to collect a few, so Jean-Pierre Saniferi, just here.
Jean Pisani, UI. This idea of thinking of the EU as a way to correct the bias in democracies in disfavor of future generations is very interesting. The question is, what does it imply? Because if it's so, we're not interested only in the EU being undemocratic, which is becoming a positive attribute. We need also to think in terms of, what determines decision-making, on which basis, and what would drive the EU towards making the right decision from an intergenerational standpoint. And here I don't see, why is it, apart from being negatively undemocratic, I don't see, what the sort of constitution it has that guarantees it's going to preserve the right of the future generation. And more precisely, there's a particular issue that's debt that was mentioned by you. So now we have debt, we have financial debt, we have the climate. There are trade-offs there. Perhaps the future generation would prefer to inherit more debt and a better climate. I mean, how do we deal with that?
We had another question at the back. And I think then we will come back to our panelists.
Alexis Jacob, I'm a student at the College of Europe. So I read recently in a magazine in France, which is called Philosophy Magazine, that people in France support the concept of equality, but they are, most of them, reluctant to one of its instruments, which is inheritance taxes. So I'd like to know, how do you deal with these paradoxes of supporting values, but not supporting the tools to implement these values? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will start with Professor Van Parijs.
Well, I won't reply to every question, so perhaps I'll just take up the two questions by Jean-Pierre Zaniferi. So, yes, and so what I said, you need a certain degree or the right sort, the right dose of democratic deficit in order to be able to make more room for the interests of the people who are not represented in our democracies, the people who are too young or the people who are not yet born. And of course, does that mean that we must then put a sort of blind trust in the bureaucrats in their offices to look after the future generations? Well, what I'm assuming here is that these people can then look at the facts in a more sort of detached way than the average voter, and they can so be affected by these facts more than by fake news or immediate things that are being said, and that may affect their own interests. But it also depends on the way in which the European Parliament functions. And it's often being said, I think rightly, that there is more deliberation in the European Parliament, real deliberation, discussion, listening to arguments, than there is in the standard national parliament. For a simple reason, again, that is related to the democratic deficit, which is that the government is doesn't need to have permanently a sort of majority in the assembly in the way in which that must happen in national government, so in national parliaments. National parliament, very often, either your party is in power and then you just have to vote the way in which the government says that you have to vote, or you are in opposition and then all you have to do is criticize whatever the government does. So in the case of the European Parliament, of course far less than perfectly, you can make room, and moving from sort of partisan fighting to deliberation is somewhat easier in the European Parliament than it is. So it's the combination of having bureaucrats who can pay attention to facts rather than to what pleases the voters, and the combination of some degree of deliberation that can do the trick. And then I'll just mention briefly, there are these trade-offs between doing more for the climate or saving more in terms of natural resources, and then having accumulating less explicit debt in the form of public debt, or implicit debt in terms of pension rights for the current generation of pensioners or the future pension. And I think that raises the question of what is the fundamental principle of intergenerational justice. Generational accounting was mentioned earlier. I think it's a useful tool in order to sort of have some picture of the way in which pension systems function, and you can generalize, include a number of other transfers that are not strictly pensions in it, but it's a too narrow view of what intergenerational justice is, precisely for that reason. I think the basic principle is that we must consume, produce, behave in all sorts of ways in the present generation in such a way that the potential for welfare of the following generations is not worse than ours. That should be the principle, that we don't have a duty to make things better for the next generation, but you have the duty not to make it worse. And because there is a lot of uncertainty, we must sort of keep a margin so that the sort of mathematical expectation of welfare must be higher for the next generation, given that there is always a risk that there'll be that must guide us both in our pension system, public debt issue, climate change, and depletion of natural resources, and of course whatever can compensate for that, which is education, building up human capital, investments of all sorts, which can compensate whatever is being lost for the next generation.
Okay, thank you very much. Lydia?
Very briefly, concerning the compulsory voting, maybe Belgium has more to say about compulsory voting. I think in Australia it's also implemented, but nevertheless, I think it's important to keep giving freedom to people to choose whether or not they want to vote, because when we go into a deep analysis on the different on different elections, we always see that there's a higher participation in in general elections in each member state, as opposed to European elections. And especially, I can give you an example in Portugal, when in the first elections for the European Parliament were in 1987, and the participation rate was 70%. But it was in combination with the general elections. It happened exactly at the same time, in the same date. Nevertheless, there was a difference of 20% for the party that won the elections in the European elections and the general elections, which means that maybe this is a way of boosting the European dimension when it's possible to align the electoral cycles. Because, and in the end, people made the distinction. One thing is voting for the national parliament, and another one is voting for the European elections. But at the same time, we increase the participation rate. So maybe it's a case study that we can take for future reference. The other question regarding the undemocratic Europe, we might have, I think, the framework, the architecture of the European Union, the European institutions is so complex. We have one parliament with different ideologies behind each one of the families, the political families. Then we have a council which has 28 other member states represented with different ideologies behind. And then we have a commission with a college of 28 commissioners. So managing like a very common and straightforward speech or message is so hard. So I think indeed we have to try to think about alternatives to better communicate what is the real impact of the EU in people's lives, on their daily lives. This is where we are failing, I'm afraid. And because I didn't have the chance earlier, what Mario said about the average representation in the European Parliament is around 53 years old. I know the young people that we participate a lot in social media. We give our opinion on a daily basis if needed, in Twitter, in Facebook, and even in Instagram. If we post a picture, we can be very vocal about something. So it means that there's other ways of participating, also with the volunteering and being part of an association, being part of your local community. So I think the change has to go through the political parties because they already exist. So we just need to harness this disruptive world where we are living in with the other tools that we have. And I think the political parties are now understanding that the young people, we don't want to be just part of an advisory council of something, or we just want to be part of a picture with a big politician standing just in front of us. We want to be seated at the same table and negotiating and telling them and telling our counterparts that we want to make sure that in the next 10 years we will be living better than our parents. That's what our parents wanted for us. So this also relates to the last question regarding equality inherited. This is how I think we can have a holistic approach and changing and open a new chapter in politics and in the communication of politics in the European Union, and speaking more for the young people, not forgetting all the other generations. We also cannot just change the world and now, oh no, we only speak to the young people at the moment. No, we have to be fair to all generations.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sickert?
To address intergenerational inequalities, I'm not sure whether the right way is to reduce the average age of the European parliamentarians or making the platform workers form unions to put the younger generations who want to make different choices, live differently, force them into our existing models. I believe we can engage them to involve their voice in different ways. I wouldn't suggest going to the streets, but I don't know what the answer is. I don't know whether we should do the real-time analysis of Instagram pictures of anyone under 30. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's something that we don't have yet. And for the last question about the wish to achieve equality and the unwillingness to pay more taxes, I think this is just the way we are. All the surveys point that people, when asked about compensation for health damages or loss of life, the compensation person wants for him or herself is always larger than what he or she is willing to pay for someone else. So we are very out for ourselves. It's good in some ways, it's bad in other ways. We just have to take this into account in making policy decisions. Example from Estonia again. Our right-wing populist party, Eurosceptic, they oppose the European directives, but they are for equal this agricultural support for Estonian farmers. So they don't want to be part of the system and apply the consensus decisions in Estonia, but they want the material benefits. So it's everywhere in our lives. We all make decisions that are beneficial for ourselves. But when we talk about governing a state or the European Union, we just need to take this into account.
Thank you. Mario?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to all these answers that have already been provided. Regarding the compulsory voting in particular, I mean, at the moment, I don't have a clear idea on this, but in principle, I wouldn't rule out this possibility because I'm personally persuaded by the fact that the democracy doesn't only require rights, but also duties. And so, I mean, there should be certain things that have been required to citizens, and there's always the possibility of a blank vote. I mean, you go to vote, and then you decide to leave the blank vote, you know? But at least you prove that you went to the premise just to vote. And regarding participation of young people, there was an interesting point. Actually, I would like to ask a question to the crowd, if I may, because there is this question I've been struggling a bit in the last months. I was thinking, when there is a trendy hashtag on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever, does it happen that the real change in society is happening, or do we need people to go to streets to see the impact of that change? I mean, does the social network change, the social network movement is real? You know what I mean?
Yes, this can be the street.
Or does it have to become something physically that we can perceive, like a Greta Thunberg movement on the streets? I don't know at the moment, honestly, because I felt that actually we need a physical participation to go to the streets and put pressure, because the physical impact is somehow completely different. And this is what struck me about the movement of Greta Thunberg. But I, for instance, with regard to the Me Too movement, I noticed that the fact of just being social was enough to raise public awareness on the issue. I don't have an answer. I don't know.
Thank you. We're going to collect maybe 2 more questions because we have less than 10 minutes. And don't hesitate this time to address it to someone specific, and then we come back to you if we have more time. Maria?
Maria, I'm a researcher here at the UI. So a lot of what has been said today, it seems to me that from financial supervision to prevent another financial meltdown, but also the need to protect the environment to avoid climate change's consequences on our lives, relies on one strong value, which is solidarity. And some weeks ago, actually together with Mario, we went to a middle school here in Florence, and I was completely caught by surprise that 11 years old could define sovereignty without any problem, but then they struggled to provide a definition of solidarity. And that made me realize that actually the current EU political discourse has taken for granted solidarity, while the recent example of financial crisis, let's start among member states, proves that this is not the case. So a direct question would be focusing on climate change. What can the EU change on the political discourse, still strongly relying on solidarity to make people understand that this is a problem for everyone, and of course it will affect differently not only generations but also different economical and social groups worldwide. And what can the EU change about that? Because with the rise of Euroscepticism and the popular movements, solidarity might not be taken for granted for long.
Thank you very much. So I extend to 3 already because we won't have time to go back to the public. So you have 2 hands raised here, one here and one here.
Hi, I'm a professor of economics in Milano, and I have a question to the youngest in the panels, which is a question that I'm now asking to many people in general. I think I would like to have the answer to this question more generally. I feel very much the urgency of climate change, okay, and environmental problems as one of the several aspects of this intergenerational inequality. But maybe the most urgent, because without a planet, there is no planet B, okay? So what would the young people think needs to be done by them? Meaning, we are here debating, you should go to the street, you should use the hashtag, you should join a political party. What do you think? What is the most effective way? What would you do? And how can we help you?
Hello, Bryony Worthington from the UK, who's just announced that we're going to be setting a net zero target for greenhouse gases by 2050, which is at least a start. I think Greta Thunberg has said it's not really fair to ask the youth to solve this, actually. She needs some help from the adults. So I'd like to ask the question, why can't we look again at how we're approaching the question of climate change and look at it from a moral perspective, not an economic perspective? Because it's quite clear to me that you can't do cost-benefit analysis on whether the planet is habitable or not. And we're using discount rates in all of the models that we do to assess whether or not we should act. This is essentially stealing the youth's future, and they should realise this. So we've got to get off this economic kind of fallacy that this is something we can work out with numbers and spreadsheets and act in a moral capacity. And that means basically setting ourselves onto the pathway of zero emissions as quickly as possible using known technologies.
Okay. Thank you. This time in this order. So Mario, you start.
Okay. No, thank you, Maria, for reminding me the nice lecture in the Scuola Media in Florence. So in terms of solidarity, what the EU has to do, I actually would like to refer what another question I've just been asked regarding what the citizens should do, because in the end, the EU is also, is also us, citizens of the EU, is not only the institutions, and as engaged academics, we can witness that. We can witness the fact that there could be citizens, engaged citizens that care about the public interest, and simply go and try to talk about Europe and what the issues of Europe, what Europe has done, what Europe could do better. This is basically what we've been done here at the UI with this fantastic working group of researchers. So I think that beyond the institutions, there are also citizens and active citizens that should have a role. And this is actually a proof of real solidarity from the bottom, because we as academics, but in any domains, in any job, there is the possibility of sharing experiences, of speaking about common challenges, common problems. This is something that any of us could do beyond the EU institutions taking over. And I think I answered more or less to 2 questions in one thing. I would like the woman that just talked to elaborate a bit more on what you mean by moral perspective. I mean, moral perspective on climate change. When we talk about moral aspects, I always think that we need to act at the lowest level possible, which is through education, unfortunately, I think. If we want to really give a moral, I know we have no time, but on the one hand, you have an institution imposing something, imposing cutting of emissions, imposing drastic economic changes to the economic system, and this is something that probably should be done, but I don't know as citizens if we're allowed if we really wanted that, it's something that we can discuss. But on the other hand, it takes time. And changes through education takes time, but probably it's the better solution. And here we also have the problem of EU powers on education. That is something that we haven't discussed, but I don't know if we have time for that.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the question about solidarity. And I have a feeling that the conception of solidarity is changing as well. We can take a Moldovan youth who might feel solidarity towards Greta Thunberg, but not towards their grandparents. So the concept is changing, and how to achieve like intergenerational equity in a situation where generations might not want to be solidar. It is a difficult question to answer. And the last question, I think this is debate. I don't think that addressing it through education is the answer. I agree. Tackling climate change is a moral issue. It doesn't matter how much it pays. It's something we need to do. If we would consider giving human rights from economic perspective, of course, it can't be cost effective. If we make exceptions, for me, tackling climate change goes to the same category as giving human rights or accepting human rights or giving them to everyone. And if every country would steer their way towards actually doing something in their economy, in their policies to address this, whether it's address the rising temperatures of the future, it would be the new type of economy. It would eventually pay. It needs new technologies. It gives jobs to many people. It's not something that automatically is very expensive or overwhelming for our current societies.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Very briefly, referring to the first question, solidarity versus sovereignty. I think the main problem is exactly we take everything for granted. And I speak now on behalf of the young generation. We don't think that our democracy, for example, is at stake. But I think we are underestimating that we won't have any such issue in the future. And I think it's also related to the lack of literacy related to the EU. I first started to know about the European Union when I studied in some years ago, probably in the secondary school, when we started learning history and where Portugal is integrated in the geographical block, etc. So it's very late in the process, and I think it somehow undermines this connection that should be built or should be developed in earlier stages of our life. The second question, what should we do to tackle climate change? I think we should start doing our own job, which is when we are advocating for climate change, we have to look at home and see if we are recycling, if we are doing if we have our individual contribution for the matter. But I can also tell you that I'm running for the European Parliament, and in my campaign I committed to do carbon neutral campaign because we are going to drive around the country. We are going to, for sure, produce a lot of CO2 emissions. So I think if we start leading by example, we also can convince others to join this urgency, this emergency of tackling climate change. And just to finalize, we know that we don't have we know that there's some political disengagement from the young generations towards the EU, but I think the young people, we have to bear in mind that we don't let our grandparents or our parents to choose the clothes that we wear every day. They don't choose the type of music that we listen to. So we cannot let them choose unilaterally their future. We have to be part of that. Thank you.
Professor Van Parijs.
Quick reaction relevant to questions 1 and 3. In a way, one possible interpretation of solidarity is precisely adopting a moral point of view as opposed to a strictly economic point of view. More precisely, you have two ways of reasoning, including about climate change. One consists in saying, I'll do as an individual or as a country what is best for me, on the assumption that all the other countries will do also what is best for them individually. And that leads to disaster because everyone tries to free riding on the others. You say, well, I'll be able to consume more petrol more cheaply if all the others spare on petrol, etc. And the moral point of view corresponds to one interpretation of solidarity, consists in saying, no, I'm going to do what's best for me as an individual or a country on the assumption that everyone else takes the same decision as me. Okay, not that everyone individually does what's best for them, assuming that all others do what is best for them individually, but each of us is taking the decision on behalf of everyone. And then you'll take into account also all the costs that would be incurred by others. And so, in a way, I mean, in more the first notion corresponds to the economic notion of a Nash equilibrium. The second one is very close to Kant's concept of universalizability, the categorical imperative. So it's really, there is a deep connection there. But this may not be sufficient. And for me, what is important is that this big problem which we have, let's face it, it's a big problem, climate change, must be turned into an opportunity. We must be able to tell our generation and the generation of the young, look, you'll consume less, but your life can be better. And how? And one of the things that is very dear to me is that in the way in which we organize our cities, we should stop focusing exclusively on sustainable mobility. Let's also talk about enjoyable immobility. That is, and what I mean by that, if there are some Belgians in the room, they may know that I triggered in 2012 a movement of civil disobedience. I said every Sunday, let's go and sit in the middle of the central lanes in Brussels, that cut the center of Brussels into an urban motorway, in order to ask for the pedestrianization of that. I said, and that's related to justice, I said it's not for an old philosopher to organize that. The Facebook generation can do that, so internet is useful also to trigger something that's physical. So let's go and picnic in the middle, so the young generation can do that. I said, but if they do it, I'll be there. I've been in prison only once in my life, but I'll be glad to go back to prison for that reason. And that's one of the ways. So this relates at the same time the importance of going to the streets in a soft way, not à la gilet jaune. And so, and picnicking is always very nice, a nice sort of a family. We need to do that, both in order to put pressure, but also to show how our lives can be improved. Despite all these problems, our life can be better by getting rid of all this excess of cars and so on. And that is crucial also for the housing question, because and so we'll have to live closer to each other. It will be more and more expensive to live in cities, and therefore it's crucial also, especially for the worse off, to have nice public spaces where we can have enjoyable immobility.
Thank you very much. So let me warmly thank the panelists and join me in applauding them.